Summer of 2021 saw me take my first steps into the Final Fantasy series, joining many fellow adventurers in the world of Eorzea through Final Fantasy XIV. Since then, I've made it a goal to go back and play through as many of the Final Fantasy core games as possible. And back in the start of this year, I had the opportunity to go back to where it all started, with the game that not only saved a company, but one that started one of the most influential gaming franchises in history. Hey everyone, it's Yggdrasiel, and today is going to be all about Final Fantasy I, or rather, the Final Fantasy I Pixel Remaster. For those who are not aware, the first 6 games within the Final Fantasy series have been remade and called Pixel Remasters. These allow for the original handful of Final Fantasy games to live up to modern standards and are that much more timeless for it. What's more, they are widely accessible on multiple platforms and have bundle options, making them great bang for your buck. Today's focus is going to be on the Final Fantasy I Pixel Remaster. Now, as I said, I only started my Final Fantasy journey through Final Fantasy XIV, the second MMO in the series right after 11, and certainly not a mainstay. In fact, prior to 14, I had only ever played spin-off series like Chocobo Dungeon and Crystal Bearers on the Wii. I hadn't truly touched any of the baseline games. But that was the past, and this is now, and through the Pixel Remasters being readily available, there was no better time to finally take that first step. The original Final Fantasy was released back in 1987, back on the Famicom, and then onto the NES. Truly meant to be the final tale told by Square at the time, it instead saw incredible success, enough to secure the future of the company and be the start of an enduring legacy. And the modern day Pixel Remaster readily makes it apparent as to how that initial appeal was so gripping. The premise and core gameplay loop of the game is readily digestible to anyone. Those are a straightforward story that encourages the player to dwell on the next step, simplistic fights that are readable with controls easy enough to pick up on without tutorials, player agency in advancing your character, be that through gear or spells, and the general feel of exploration, be it through the wide and open overworld or through sprawling caverns and castle ruins. Paired up exquisitely with beautiful sprite art as well as touch-ups on Nobuo Uematsu's first venture into the world of composing, my attention was immediately gripped in the first few opening hours of the journey. And it's a good thing that it did, because those starting fights can be brutal, especially with how RNGesus doesn't usually like to shine upon me. Let me tell you, running into a full pack of mobs on my second fight and getting beaten to a bloody pulp was an eye-opening reminder of the difficulty of the times. Paired with random encounters that occur a bit more frequently than I would have liked, and the first few moments of the game had me just grinding away outside the starting town of Cornelia until I felt just a bit more safe. All of which then just to have that feeling completely flipped on its head when I then confronted Garland, the first boss, only to crush him in about 3 or 4 turns. Maybe I just leveled a bit too much at the time, I thought, but unfortunately that wasn't to be the case, as most bosses were often easier than some of the random encounters within their own dungeons. In fact, as the game progressed and I made my way to more towns that offered more options for my mages, I found the game only became more and more easier. Still being cautious, of course, knowing that all it took was one bad RNG encounter, but otherwise comfortable enough. The trend in difficulty then continued on until the final encounter with Chaos, Garland's ultimate transformation. A funny enough juxtaposition of that very first fight, quite literally turning into chaos. I must have spent about 4 or 5 attempts spanning hours just on that final fight alone, due to both the staggering leap in difficulty, and again, RNGesus spitting on me as Kuraga just undid everything I whittled away at multiple times. Defeating Chaos was in and of itself an extremely rewarding encounter, and the final message that played on after is one that warmed my heart, as the title of Warrior of Light has been forever etched onto it. I next want to discuss bits of the overworld, the characters, and dungeon setups. Now, of course, I was ecstatic to see many of the original concepts that would then go on to be common recurrences or nods in the future games, especially as I have said earlier, through my experience with Final Fantasy XIV. The establishment of crystals, the 4 fiends, Matoya, Sid Garland, the airship, Bahamut, Excalibur, and much, much more, and it was a joy to see how each of said concepts were represented within their original appearance. As for the overworld, the sense of progression all the way to the airship was great, starting out on small landmasses, and then through helping the people of various towns you get more avenues of exploration right up until you get to the airship, and the whole world just became available to explore. And it always was such a breath of fresh air to be in that overworld, especially after I was done spelunking in one of several dungeons within that game, because again, especially at the start, some random encounters can be brutal. All the more so when I was 3 or 4 floors down and running low on healing spells and items. Dungeon layouts themselves, however, weren't anything worth writing home to. Mostly random encounters and rooms meant to soak up your steps to again goad you into more encounters. And lastly, the primary medium of interaction, the combat. Now, I know many people that can only think of how good a game is solely based on how the combat plays out. Often they look at a game, and if the combat is too simple, too straightforward, they might lose interest in it rather quickly. But in my personal opinion, the earnestly straightforward combat and mechanics of Final Fantasy I is one of its biggest charms and assets. There's nothing overly complex. Your physical attackers are going to melee around every round, while your spellcasters will be either providing buffs or heals or joining in nuking your enemies. You know your loadouts on the mages because you build and curate what you want on them, and your melee attackers are going to tend to get a bit more gear, especially items with flavor like Firebrand and Excalibur. And then seeing my party grow to the extent that I was no longer fearful of random encounters about midway through the journey was a feeling that raised a bit of my own personal confidence, making me feel like the results were showing and that I could venture a bit beyond the comfort zones I established early on. As for the story itself, again, it's nothing super complex. You're 4 heroes venturing out into the wide open world, each with a crystal to bear to light the way for future generations as you tackle on the 4 fiends. There's a bit more exposition and lore and world building towards the end of the game, especially as you reach some of those hidden towns that can only be accessible by airships. Finding Bahamut was a delight, and the optional dungeon that you have to explore to curry his favor was also quite joyous. I will say that it was pretty loose-fitting overall, and if I had to make any sort of statement, it almost felt like a giant D&D nod, but with twists that would go on to be the staple of what Square games would come to mean. Overall, quick pros as I mentioned before, it's a straightforward journey with clear progression throughout the game, paired up with a beautiful soundtrack and gorgeous sprite art. As for the cons, it's a bit overbearing on random encounters, and dungeon bosses are often complete pushovers right up until the final fight. I also want to add my personal vendetta against the Water Temple solely for that one treasure room that is the only room in the game, I think, where you can go to one side and then pop out of the other. I had to venture back in that room twice after I originally left the temple, but I digress. If I had to give this game a personal rating, I feel that I could give it a solid 3 out of 5 stars. It's well worth the time to play through, and you can definitely see the appeal of how this journey then went on to serve as a blueprint in shaping the generations of games to come. But tell me, how do you feel about the Final Fantasy I Pixel Remaster? Do you agree with my thoughts on the difficulty, the world, the scaling, etc.? Please let me know. I'm very curious to see what you all think. But that's going to be all from me today. As always, thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video. Please let me know what you think in the comments down below, and if you'd like, please consider subscribing for more video game content. With all of that said, thank you very much for your time, and as always, have a great day.